In the quiet town of Evermore, nights were still, disturbed only by the occasional howl of the wind winding through empty streets. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, a place of old houses, narrow lanes, and local shops that closed well before sunset. But the people of Evermore had a strange tradition, a ritual almost. At exactly midnight, many residents would tune their radios to a strange, local-only frequency, station 89.3. The station didn't play music, news, or even ads. Instead, it featured a lone, gravelly voice that drifted through the static, whispering cryptic warnings. It was an unmarked station, broadcasting only in Evermore, and no one knew who was behind it. People simply called it the Midnight Broadcast. One cold November night, as frost began to creep up the windows, Mary Jensen leaned in close to her old, crackling radio. She was a widow in her 60s and a lifelong resident of Evermore. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the dial to 89.3. Every night, without fail, she listened to the broadcast. It had become a town ritual, a strange comfort wrapped in an unsettling routine. As the static cleared, the familiar voice came through, soft and raspy, like a whisper from a distant nightmare. "Good evening, Evermore," the voice drawled, each word dripping with an eerie calm. "Tonight, the shadows linger a little longer. The night grows a little colder. Remember, the darker the night, the closer they come." Mary felt a chill run down her spine. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. Each broadcast was like this, vague, unsettling. But tonight, there was something different, something sharper, closer. The voice continued, "If you're listening, beware. Tonight is special, a night when things go awry. Now listen closely. There will be an accident on Baker Street. Be careful. Someone you know may not make it home." Mary's heart skipped. Baker Street was just around the corner. She quickly grabbed her phone and called her neighbor, Helen, who lived on Baker Street. Helen didn't answer, and Mary's hands began to tremble. She dialed again, but still no response. A shiver ran down her spine as she listened to the broadcast. "For those on Maple Lane, lock your doors. Don't answer the knocks. Not everyone is who they seem to be." Her heart pounded. Maple Lane was nearby, too. The cryptic warnings felt like they were getting closer and closer to her own home. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel, a young mechanic, sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment. His radio played the same broadcast, and he smirked. He'd never believed in the stories about the station, dismissing it as an old wives' tale meant to scare children. But as he listened, he felt a strange, creeping dread. "Tonight the lights will flicker on Oak Drive," the voice said, pausing as if to savor the words. "They will flicker, and then they will go out." Daniel's blood turned cold. Oak Drive was where he worked. Just then the lights in his room began to flicker. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the bulb above him. Suddenly, everything went dark. As the silence grew, he could hear a faint scratching at his window. His heart raced, each beat louder than the last. The scratching became louder, more frantic. He backed away from the window, stumbling into the table and knocking over a glass. It shattered, and the sound echoed in the darkness. Then, a soft knock on his door. Who's there?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. But there was no reply, only another knock, louder, insistent. In her house, Mary clutched her rosary, praying under her breath as she listened to the broadcast. "Some of you won't make it to morning," the voice whispered, soft but chilling. "But if you're clever, maybe you'll survive. For those on Evergreen Street, keep your eyes on the shadows. Sometimes they move, and sometimes they're not shadows at all." Mary gasped. Her sister lived on Evergreen Street. She scrambled to her feet and reached for her coat. She couldn't sit here and wait for something to happen. She had to check on her family. As she stepped outside, the night air felt heavy and oppressive. A thick fog had rolled in, clinging to the streets like a living thing. She moved quickly, her footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. As she passed a dark alley, she heard a faint whisper, a soft, low hiss that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Mary?" She froze, her blood running cold. She knew that voice. It was her late husband's. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the shadows. But there was no one there, just fog and darkness. The voice from the radio continued, carried on the still night air. "Sometimes the ones you've lost are closer than you think. Closer than they should be." Panic seized her. She ran, not daring to look back. The broadcast droned on, filling the empty streets with its haunting words. By the time she reached Evergreen Street, Mary's heart was racing. She banged on her sister's door, desperate, her breaths coming in gasps. The door swung open, and her sister, pale and shaken, stood there. "Did you hear it too?" her sister whispered, clutching Mary's arm. "The broadcast. It mentioned my street. I thought I saw someone outside, watching." They both turned to look down the street, their gazes fixed on the shifting fog. Shadows seemed to move within it, twisting and stretching, forming shapes that couldn't possibly be human. In the distance, the radio broadcast continued, the voice growing softer, more distorted, almost as if it were fading away. "Evermore," it murmured. "You've listened so well tonight. But remember, some warnings come too late, and some visitors never truly leave." The fog thickened, swallowing the street, the houses, and every trace of life within it. The broadcast fell silent, and the town of Evermore was plunged into an unnatural, suffocating stillness. By morning, Mary's house was empty, her radio still tuned to 89.3, playing only static.